Oh, sorry, I just realized I was muted. Okay. Okay. My speech is going to start in 3, 2, 1. We think minorities need accurate representation and they need more awareness of their issue to understand the situation they are in. We think on their side of the house, you push forward minorities into a false perception that they have to be successful, that they have to be confident always, regardless of the struggles that they have. We think that this is extremely difficult, and in order to empower and accurately represent minorities, we're so proud to propose 2 arguments from first speaker. Firstly, on accurate representation. Secondly, about how we get more awareness of minority issues. Before moving into arguments, just a brief points of setup, right? We think this is likely to represent the most realistic scenario of the minority, which in the extreme instances may be suffering like slavery in some instances. In the other more probable scenario, we think it will be hyper-realistic scenarios like discrimination in the school cafeteria, not being admitted by your family if you're a gay individual, so forth. However, since nobody's just going to watch an hour and a half of just pure struggle, the artworks are likely to focus on how the minority protagonists find meaning and hope within their struggling situations, and therefore this would outframe any case coming from opposition about how there will be a lack of positive role models for the minority. And we think this is what is going to be emphasized in these kinds of artworks. First argument then about accurate representation. The thesis under this is that the principle of the value of artworks should be in the fact that they accurately represent the minority community and that it empowers them as an individual viewer, but also as a community as a whole. So there's 2 mechanisms as how we get accurate representation. Firstly, we think quite intuitively, we're able to depict the realities of the struggle more comparatively to their side of the house. Because in general, we think minority individuals go through extreme struggles that are beyond our imagination. Things like being discriminated 24/7, not being employed, being constantly bullied at school because of who you are and who you are as an identity. Thus, these struggle-based artworks are more to the point of what their lives actually look like compared to the utopia-based depictions, the utopia-based having superpowers and unrealistic depictions on their side of the house. But the second and more important mechanisms is on how you get more opt-in from the minority community. There are 2 reasons under this, right? A, you get more opt-in from the minority individuals because of shared experience. What I mean by this is that the fact that minority producers and actors are more likely to be able to identify that the character that they're depicting, the character that they're playing, impacts the way they're able to act and communicate and impacts the way they are confident on the set. We think this allows viewers to identify more with these producers and with these actors. Moreover, we think neighborhoods who are key in understanding the accurate depictions through interviews or having extra cast are likely to cooperate more on our side of the house. This necessarily means you have more information that becomes the foundation and the basis of the storyline you depict, which becomes more detailed and accurate on our side of the house. But the second reason why you get more opt-in from the minority individuals is because of more external support. This looks like the African American lobbying organizations or famous individuals like Beyonce catering towards African American hyper realistic like artworks that depict hyper realistic struggles. This is because we think in general they identify that there's a huge gap between the utopian based artworks, and that's why they're less likely to voice out their support. We think this is important because they provide funds and resources that allows for more detailed and realistic sets and more high technology to be used inside these movies. So given these 2 crucial mechanisms as how we get accurate representation, this leads to 3 important impacts. Firstly, we think minority viewers feel more empowered on our side of the house because of accurate representation. Rather than seeing a character that is successful and different from the reality they themselves are in, for example, Black Panther having superpowers, being really rich, we think these individuals are able to identify and increase the relatability with the actors which is uniquely in the struggle-based artwork. We think this allows you to find happiness within your struggles rather than pressured and rather being doomed because you think you can never get to where where you think you can never get to where Black Panther is. You think you can't get to where the utopian character actually is. But the second point of impact is practically you get more minority artists in these types of artwork based on the mechanism by what I told you about the more opt-in for minorities. We think this means two things, right? A, you get more hirement opportunities. You get more people like producers and actors who are in these movies because they don't backlash against utopian artworks. They identify more with the characters. But second of all, we think you get a venue for these artists, like new upcoming artists, to be able to express themselves, be able to express their true lived experiences through these types of movies and artworks. But the third impact is on the principle of representation. We think crucially, artworks do not have tangible value other than the sub-products of having money, having sales, and so forth. Therefore, we think the true value that should be placed on these artworks is on how it accurately depicts the character's emotion and represents the whole community of who they are in the movie. So we think the conclusion of this argument is because of accurate representation, we get more practical impacts and it empowers the minority individuals and community as a whole. Before moving into the second argument on more awareness, I'm willing to take a POI.
What is a person from the majority more likely to be aware of? The nuances of the queer community and how accepting they are, or that homophobia is bad and generally should be opposed?
Well, I think I'm going to talk about this in our second argument but I think there has to be a tipping point for these centrist or progressive individuals to be able to really deeply care about the issues that they talk about. We think there has to be some kind of shock value and an accurate representation of the gruesome realities that they're actually going towards. But I also talked about how the minority individuals are going to backlash towards these utopian arts because it isn't an accurate representation. We think at the point in which you lose minority support of that community, that has more harm, as I talked about in our first argument. So second argument on more awareness, right? I just want to substantiate what do these hyper-realistic artwork that we support on our side of the house look like? Firstly, we think there's a lot of shock value, right? Because it's gruesome depictions of you being bullied. It is the character, the minority individual, being suicidal because no one around them understands you. But second of all, we think it's intentionally differentiated from the majority, right? Because the majority do not understand the reality. They're in an entirely different world from which the minority has experienced from the past. So given this premise, how do we get more awareness? Firstly, we think we provide a tipping point for people to truly care about minority issues. This is because of the general tendency for people to be complacent, to people to separate their reality and not care about others who are from an entirely different world, who don't have shared lived experience. We think that the gruesome reality in the fact that them realizing, oh, that this is really shocking, that they have to go through this kind of suffering, allows them a tipping point to really care about voting issues on minority and so forth. But secondly, we think you just get more buy-in in terms of quantity, right? A, because we told you it's more accurate, you get more buy-in from viewers because they understand and they value the artwork, right? But B, we think you get more media representation at the point in which famous individuals and lobbying organizations cater for these accurate forms of artwork, right? The implication then is you get more buy-in and you get actually more tipping point for people, for the majority to cater for your artwork. The impact is simple, right? We think on their side of the house, you create a narrative of self-responsibility. At the point in which the majority sees minority individuals successful, we think the minorities who aren't in that stage are likely to be blamed, that it's because they didn't put in effort that they are in that state and so forth. And that's why we're so proud to propose.
I would like to thank that speaker for the fine speech. I would like to invite the first speaker on negative. Whenever you're ready, here.
Hi, I'm so sorry, but I think our third speaker dropped out, but he just joined back, I think. Akindu, are you here?
Yeah, I'm incredibly sorry, guys. My electricity went out.
Right. Okay, no worries. We can start now. Yeah.
Judicator, are you guys ready?
Yes, we are. You can begin whenever you're ready.
POIs, my pronouns are he, him, and my POI preference is to have POIs in the chat. Yes, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. As a Muslim minority individual myself, I don't need a movie to tell me that I undergo racism. I don't need a movie to tell me that the world looks down on Muslims. But what I do need is a movie to show me that the world can be a better place, that the world isn't as bleak as it seems, that the future can be better for all of us. I want to make a few points of framing before I move on with my rebuttals. Firstly, when it comes to minority movies, for the most part, it is minority individuals who watch them. So if we can prove to you that we create a better world for these minorities through these movies, we think we take this debate. Second point of framing then is that minority media is hard fought for, meaning that the opportunity to create minority content is limited, meaning that we can't necessarily have a world where we have both utopias and both realistic content. It's a zero-sum game and we need to choose. Third point of framing then is that for the large part, the problems faced of the past are largely known. Things like slavery, things like women being denied the right to vote, things like gay marriage being illegal for the longest time are things that are known within society. What we do need then is hope for a better future and also knowledge about more pervasive, more subtle problems in society like racism in day-to-day life. Okay, moving on into my rebuttals then. First rebuttal, I'll be dealing with each of their arguments. So their first argument on accurate representation. I'd like to note here that this argument is a means to an end, because what good is perfect representation if it gets nothing done? So at the point at which we can prove to you that accurate representation only locks people out instead of brings people in, we can take this argument. But the next thing that they say here is that you can get opt-in. Opt-in because more people can relate to it. I'd like to point out that this only applies to a very specific group of people. Because if you aren't like a dirt poor black person, like maybe if you're relatively affluent, maybe if you don't go through that much racism, then you can't relate to it. And this opt-in doesn't necessarily exist. But further, we'd argue that seeing yourself on screen is relatable enough for most of these minority individuals. Because seeing someone who looks just like you, with like curly hair like you, or similar facial features to you, with a similar skin color to you, that's been locked out of media for such a long time, is enough for you to feel that sense of relatability. The third thing they say under this argument is that you get celebrity support. I'd like to point out that this support exists anyway, regardless of the media that exists, because firstly, it is about minority individuals and minority actors are likely to care about minority issues. So even if it's portrayed through a utopian movie, they're likely to still support it. But further, fellow Black, Muslim or gay actors given that it's your fellow Black, Muslim or gay actors who act in these movies, you're likely to want to share support for them anyway. So for the large part, this argument is symmetric on both sides. Okay, second argument then that they bring out is about awareness. And essentially the premise of this argument is that you provide a shock value which acts as a tipping point. I'd like to flip this argument on them because note, they never proved to us why this movie is likely to be watched by the majority at all. Because if it's so traumatic, if it's so shocking, if it's so brutal, why would these minority individuals watch it in the first place? We'd argue that they either don't watch it, and even if they do watch it, they'd be either desensitized to the violence, or they'd be either disincentivized to help these minority groups. Okay, moving on into argumentation.
POI.
Argument, viewers in chat. First argument on how we gather more support to these minority groups. Framing here, because in the status quo, awareness about minority issues and past minority struggles are broadly symmetric, because you have big movements like the LGBT movement, the feminist movement, the BLM movement, you have social media activism and everything else. So then why exactly are realistic movies harmful? Three main reasons. Firstly, because you alienate a large group of people through making this about a political issue. Because note that most minority struggles in the past are to a large part significantly political. So at the point at which individuals feel like they're going to a movie and being stuffed a political message down their throat, they are less likely to watch it. Say, for example, you're a Republican Texas teenager. You're less likely to watch 12 Years of a Slave than you are to watch something like Black Panther. So on the comparative, utopian movies are largely non-political and aren't about contentious issues within society, meaning that you can watch it and enjoy it despite not being of that particular group. Second reason that realistic movies are harmful is because even if you're okay with the politicization, the doom and gloom, the shock and the violence of this movie is likely to make it significantly negative, meaning that not many people are likely to want to watch it because it's sad and brutal. The reason for this is because for many people, cinema is an escape, especially if you're a minority individual. You want to go there and be given a sense of lightheartedness, not to be reminded how terrible the world is. On the comparative, we're able to show a happy and ideal world that romanticizes what kind of world we could achieve. This is likely to give hope to minority individuals. Third reason that realistic movies are harmful is because to get any of their impacts, you need hyper-realistic movies. Meaning you show all the gore. You show like black people or Muslim people being beaten up, blood flowing everywhere. This is likely to lead to two things. Either majority individuals are disengaged or desensitized. This means that when they see the violence, they become disengaged. They don't want to watch it anymore. They simply don't engage with this kind of content. Or since they are so used to shock effect time and time again, they are less, the whole argument of like tipping point falls apart. I'd like to note here that this is important because this now crowds out activists, because the relatively less brutal forms of oppression are less shocking, and people see them as actually being lucky that they aren't having to go through the problems that they faced in the past. So like a black person being called the N-word is obviously going to be less shocking to you than them being brutally torn to pieces, right? So therefore, they're likely to get less support from majority individuals. The impact of this argument is astounding, because on their side, you reduce the awareness that is raised and you take away from the possibility of accruing critical mass that can actually create tangible change for these minority groups. Second argument then on how you strengthen minority hope and minority communities on our side of the house. Framing here is that minority media, as I said before, is consumed largely by minorities. So if you can prove that you create a better world for them, we win. So then, second point of framing is that the people who watch this media are likely to be of two groups: the people who face the problem shown in the movie and the people who don't face the problem shown in the movie. These can even be people from the same minority group. So say, for example, it's a movie about like the oppression faced by black people. Maybe you're a rich black man who doesn't really have to go through this because you're relatively more affluent. Maybe you're a light-skinned man who doesn't have to go through this because you don't look all that black. Now you automatically crowd out these individuals. And we think that this type of movies are harmful for three reasons. Firstly, because these individuals, especially those of the upper class, now feel that they can't accurately represent their community. I can't go and talk on behalf of my community because I'm not a real black man. I don't go through the problems that a real black man is. I'm rich, I'm privileged. This locks out a large group of people from your community. Second reason it's harmful is because minorities already know about the struggles that they go through. Like, I don't need to watch a movie about Muslim racism to know what kind of issues Muslims face, meaning that this movie doesn't really accomplish much, given that mostly minority individuals watch this movie anyway. Third reason it's harmful is because given that minority movies are overly negative, so say, for example, happy endings for gay movies being really, really rare, people are unlikely to come. The comparative here is that when you show a world of what the community could be without exclusion, a world where black people could be so rich and prosperous without having to face racism, you're reminded why your struggle is worth it, why you need to keep fighting, why you need to keep striving for a world that is better. And this provides you with hope and it galvanizes you to live for a better world. A major benefit here is that now majority individuals are given an independent reason to care, because if they know about historical oppression, then they're likely to care anyway. But now they're given another reason because they know that these minority groups have hope. The LGBTQ movement can live in a world where gay people aren't discriminated. And that is a world that is worth fighting for. And I must be an ally that supports that. So for all those reasons, given that we create a far, far better world for these minority groups, oppose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for that fine speech. I'd like to invite the second speaker on side proposition whenever you're ready here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Cool. I will take my POIs through chat. Please don't interrupt me. Speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Artworks are the way in which societal preconceptions are constructed. It is the way in which children who don't necessarily read the news all the time get their first conception of a struggle as a minority. It is the only way white people can visualize these struggles of minorities and empathize to fill in those lack of lived experiences. The depiction being utopic means that minority movements will lose its one and only connecting gap between the majority and their struggles, and that is absolutely terrible. I'm going to do 2 sections of response to the debate. First, on their second argument about giving hope to minorities, and secondly, on inspiring social change. Firstly, let's respond respond to their argument on giving hope, which is talking about the individual level of a minority and how the minority perception of themselves changes on both sides. Their argumentation here is quite simple, to say that it inspires minorities because it gives them hope that things can become better. 3 layers of response here. 1, we can see that people already know the suffering that they're going through, but it is unclear as to why we also cannot be hopeful. We frame this to you in first, go check your notes. Secondly, I think the premise of their argumentation is wrong, because the premise here is that you can watch utopian movies, which gives you hope about yourself. This is false, because the conditions that the people in these utopian movies are in is very different from yours, so it is hard to relate as an individual. Many times, utopic movies implies a miracle happens, like getting a really competitive scholarship or winning the lottery, escaping from North Korea, which is just unlikely for the vast majority of individuals. We already framed to it first why this is likely to be the characterization of utopic movies. The third response here is to flip this argument to say that we give more hope, but in a way that the hope manifests better and is more useful for actually making those hopes come true. Why is this bad on their side? 2 reasons. 1, you give false hope, because when you try to put these tactics into action, it's just unlikely to work, and this means that people are starting to internalize these issues and think that, hey, there's an issue with me because I tried these tactics that this movie protagonist worked, but it's obviously not going to work for you because you are living in the real world while this person is living in a utopia, which also means that people around you are going to blame this individual as well and be like, hey, why didn't you work as hard as this other person? Why aren't you able to do this? At best, people around them don't think that they're suffering, which also means that there's less societal support and they need to respond to that. The second reason why this is bad is because the way you try to fix your problems just becomes unnuanced and unrealistic to a way that is actually likely for you to succeed in the real world. The real world and utopia is clearly just very different, just on a empirical basis. This is better specifically on our side because you can show people how to find happiness in their daily realistic aspects of suffering and give them a tool in the toolbox to get out of these situations. For example, the show Kim's Convenience is a comedy show that realistically portrays these struggles that Korean Americans go through. There's no utopic ending about how everything becomes better for these individuals, or Mr. Kim suddenly speaking perfect Korean, or their third culture kids suddenly becoming adaptive to Korean culture. No, it's very realistic in the way that it portrays how these types of communities get misunderstood in America, how there's a lack of familial structure within these places because there's a lack of experience between the parent and the child. But it shows how these individuals were able to deal with these issues. You're getting things like translators, the daughter becoming a bridge, able to seek new relationships and taking risks in their relationships. And this is just a much more relatable and tangible way that people can watch these movies and learn how to change their lives. So I probably cannot escape North Korea. I probably cannot just fly to a different country to make a life there, but I can try to, for example, work around the store more often or try to study a bit more so I can get closer to reaching that scholarship. Then a miracle happens in a utopia, which helps you as an individual find solutions for the problems that you are facing, which tangibly brings better impacts to people. So the way in which hope manifests is just significantly better on our side. Note then that this is mutually exclusive. So opposition can't just be like, well, you can do this too on our side of the house, because utopic movies don't want to portray realistic struggles because it's just simply not as interesting. It is much more intense to show someone running away from their country or magically escaping their oppressive regime than showing how someone is thriving and managing to survive in these abusive situations and how they're able to find happiness through liking the boy next door. But people watch, and specifically as they say, people watch these movies as an escape from reality. So you watch sci-fi movies because there's an unrealistic aspect of it that thrills you and draws you into it, which just means that they cannot claim this benefit to be mutually exclusive or to try to claim this on their side of the house. Note then, panel, that this is the most important clash in the round for the likelihood of impacts, because whether or not opposition gets more buy-in from the majority or whether this changes every single person in society is probably subjective, but the most objective benefit in this debate is that the minorities who are watching this movie are more likely to feel represented and feel that that is an accurate portrayal of who they are, which is important to them for being able to get empowerment, being able to form communities, and feeling unity and relatability to this movies. Secondly, on a societal level, on which side is able to use this art to get tangible impacts and for better standards of lives for minorities. Although failing to respond to our argument in first, it's quite ground losing for 3 reasons. 1, there's an indefinite number of people that are able to get better and that are able to better their quality of life if we get structural changes on our side. If we're able to rally more people and get protests, get closer to policy changes, that just helps a massive degree of people. Number 2, even if the likelihood of change right now is small, this becomes a stepping stone to getting those changes in the future, and this is good because the change that this could do is massive while the harm is quite small, so it is a net good on utility. But lastly, their response that they give to most of our argumentation is, we're going to prove that this doesn't actually have tangible impacts, but they don't actually prove this to you, which means that their response, the vast majority of our argumentation, doesn't fly. Our argument then was about opt-in. They say if you don't face a lot of discrimination, this doesn't change you. Yes, if this is true, it is a wash, but this is probably not the main scope of the debate. The debate is probably about the vulnerable people who need these role models the most, because let's characterize who's most likely to get inspired by a role model. It is people who are of the lowest social economic class who cannot find inspiration in other places or in tangible places around them. Children whose parents both didn't go to university. Children who grew up in violence-stricken gang areas. And for these children that are in these unfortunate circumstances, regardless of whether it is utopic or hyper-realistic, the struggle that they went through is probably likely to be quite disastrously bad, and is probably not super nuanced in these movies. The debate then is about the scale of relatability for these individuals. Obviously, the hyper-realistic may not be a perfect representation of their struggles, but it is considerably much more relatable than a utopian representation, because the scale of difference that you have towards that person in that realistic movie is significantly smaller than the scale you have towards the utopic person. This is important because we're able to give role models to the most vulnerable that otherwise do not have capacity to voice their opinions. This is the only way for them to get comfort. The second response we get here is that if you see someone with a similar skin color to you, you feel a sense of relatability anyways. 3 things I want to note here. 1, if this is true, this also washes away all of their impacts on getting more activism, because apparently if you look like someone, you just suddenly support them anyways. But secondly, it is just unclear as to why this is true. This is like saying every Asian person supports each other because they all look the same, or that every autistic person likes every movie about autism. This is just not true empirically when you look at how many autistic people are against movies like Good Doctor because it gives false representation about them, and the amount of media backlash we've seen towards these types of autistic movies. So on a scale of relatability and likelihood, they necessarily need to engage with this on a weighing and on a structural basis, and then failing to do so is round losing. The indirect response we then get through their argumentation is that people are unlikely to watch this movie on our side. 2 things I want to point out. 1, I think their mechanism is wrong, because their mech here is that things are going to get politicized, but it is unclear why all realistic movies are going to be political. You can have movies about young Black minorities getting bullied in school, and it is unclear as to why that necessarily has to become political. But secondly, obviously, producers are not stupid, and they're not going to do this to an extreme extent to become political. They're going to be strategic about the way in which they produce these movies, and so this is just unlikely to happen. But even if this is true and we have less viewership on our side, let's weigh this argument. There's 2 independent ways why viewership is less important. 1, the impact that it has towards minorities is just less important, because for the minority watching the movie, it matters significantly less about the rating of the movie than if they actually feel like they're getting represented on the movie. But secondly, if one movie is good enough, it can become a cult of personality for these communities, so we reach their end impact better. If we have one good movie on our side, even if you have less movies, that becomes round winning, because those movies continue for long periods of time and become bonding points for these communities. The second thing they tell you is that people become desensitized. But we give you 2 layers of tipping point analysis, and first, it just goes entirely unresponded to. 1, that when you see graphic images, your sense of empathy is likely to be inspired. But number 2, this tips the reason why people do not act right now, which is simply that they cannot think or imagine what these daily struggles look like, because there's a lack of lived experiences. The issue right now is not that the majority doesn't have hope for these individuals. There are success stories that we see everywhere. It's just that people genuinely just do not care, and they do not know how much of a harm there is towards them. They do not feel an incentive to act anymore, because they don't think their lives are as bad as they actually are, and they glorify those things within them. For all those reasons, proudly propose.
I would like to thank the speaker for that fine speech. I would like to invite the second speaker on side opposition. Whenever you're ready, here.
Hi, can I be seen and heard if I speak like this?
Yes, you're audible and visible.
Great. I'll take POIs either in the chat or audibly, whichever works. Proposition loses this debate because their conceptualization of how brutal this hyper-realistic portrayal is going to be is strong when it is convenient for them in first, and weak when it is convenient for them in second. We were consistent. We said it is likely to be strong and therefore far more likely to create harm on minorities and far less likely to create broader social activism. 2 areas of response in this speech. Firstly, then, on who creates more, on who benefits minorities
minorities more. Let's note the strategic shift that they make in second, because their first speaker's 6-minute long first argument was about how they create more social awareness. When we took that down in first, somehow their benefit or biggest part to victory becomes minorities. Here's why we win on this as well, because their engagement here is extremely flippant, because all they say here is, hope is not like exclusive to your side. We can still have hopeful movies too. Okay, let's bring back the characterization that their prop one gave about what these movies look like. They will be extremely shocking and brutal because, quote unquote, they want it to be a tipping point, because that brutality and that shock and that strength of emotion is exactly and only the thing that will get majority to understand how bad this oppression really is. If this is the case, how then do you incorporate hope into the message? If, for example, your protagonist finally figures out a way to live their life happily at the end of whatever TV series they wanted to talk about, why is this the shocking tipping effect that gets minorities to buy into you? I'm going to assume that their 6-minute first speaker's argument is probably more important to their case than this one-line response in second. The second thing they tell you here is that we give them false hope, and hence they internalize their failure, because why can't I be like Black Panther? We already told you, Panna, that these are utopias. People can probably draw the line between fiction and reality. But more importantly, things like Black Panther, things like Themyscira are literally about those communities existing independent of like their oppression. Afrofuturism isn't about how if African countries just work a bit harder, they can be much better. It is rather about what African countries might have looked like without colonialism. This response just does not make sense. The final weird claim they throw out towards the end of their second speaker is that they get better role models. But surely, again, if this suffering is really, really visceral and brutal so as to create that tipping point effect, I'm not really sure why your role model needs to be a black slave who gets whipped over and over for not picking cotton enough daily. I'm going to quickly deal with the analysis that they push out in first here, because all they have here is an unmechanized principle as to how accurate representation of what minorities go through in status quo is apparently the most important thing, and we should respect it above all else. When my first speaker pointed out that this just does not make sense, insofar as we can get better representation or like better outcomes of minorities and more broader social acceptance for minorities through the portrayal of our utopic media, the second speaker entirely drops this mechanism. But the second weird thing they tell you here is that they have more minority opt-in. They say that people like to have, they say that those minority communities like these realistic portrayals of their struggle. But why is this likely to be the case? Clearly, as we pointed out, they know the struggles they go through already. They don't need to watch a movie to realize the struggles they go through. But secondly, this is probably empirically untrue. The Black community far preferred Black Panther to 12 years as a slave. Possibly, this has something to do with the second argument that we gave you, that they disengage from completely as well. But the second thing I would note is that, like my first speaker already pointed out, their own analysis cutbacks at them here, because as they say, things like the ACLU, celebrities like Beyonce care about promoting the struggles that Black people go through in status quo. Probably that would exist symmetrically on our side as well. Why is it that only these movies have the ability to create this kind of awareness? We would then suggest that these claims are unlikely to be true. If their biggest part to victory now is to say, there might be someone who doesn't read the news and only this movie is going to tell them about the oppression Black people go through, I think we already gave you enough analysis as to why those specific types of people are the ones who are least likely to opt into watching these kinds of movies as well. But even if that is untrue, we would suggest that this is an extremely marginal group of people. Realistically, panel, a vast majority of people in the world probably know that Black people face racism, probably know that gay people are excluded from society. It is unclear why this extreme minority of bigots is their biggest path to victory. Here is why I'm going to wait, why their failure to respond to our analysis is so damning to their case. Because first, these are the groups of individuals who are most vulnerable. On our side, we can give them some hope. We can make them realize why their struggle that they go to daily is worth it. Because if they stick through it now, maybe their future generations of their community can live better. Maybe gay kids in the future don't have to be structurally excluded from society, and that makes them hope for a better world. But the second thing I would note is that the uniqueness of our benefit is far more unique than theirs, because like we said, they probably get more awareness about like oppression through other means. Comparatively, only media representations of a hopeful world is likely to accrue on our side, because things like movements often don't have the time to portray what the world would look like without oppression, because they're far too busy calling that oppression out in the first place. But the final metric by which you should weigh this clash is that we have a duty to probably inspire our own community to revitalize and galvanize these struggles that we go through to benefit our own community. The only line of duty to represent them accurately is completely unmechanized. It is far too late to give it analysis in that third speech. Before my second clash, I can take a view.
If someone from a third world country watches a movie produced from a first world country on Beyonce's world tour and how she became an inspirational artist, do you really think that's going to inspire them compared to an actually realistic movie about their struggles?
Yes, because Beyonce is still a Black woman who faces structural racism. You face structural racism, she overcame it. Maybe you can't turn into the next Beyonce, but you are probably still inspired to overcome your structural racism and be successful at whatever you want to do. Second clash then on who creates more broader social awareness. And here's why they just completely ditched their second argument, because apparently I'm not sure why they didn't want to respond. Because all they say is that, they get shock value. Notice the second speaker contradicts this. I already pointed this out. But we told you that this shock value is actually a bad thing. Why is this the case? Because if this brutality, if this portrayal of this brutality is going to be as extreme as they want it to be, we foresee two outcomes of majoritarian individuals watching this. One, either they disengage, they think, it was extremely horrible for Black people who were treated like animals as slaves in the past, and they stop that thought process there because they don't want to continue thinking about this horrible, horrible thing that they don't want to think about. Or either they continue watching this, they continue thinking about it on props best case, and they become desensitized to that, because clearly being called the N-word doesn't matter as much as your ancestors being whipped for not picking enough cotton. We would then suggest that this locks out like activist movements in the status quo from being able to fight for actual structural problems that exist now. We don't care if they increase opposition among white people to abolish slavery. That has already been done. What we need is change on the ground that affects change, that affects people in status quo. But the second thing they tell you here is that apparently they get more structural change, and this is a stepping stone to the future. I'm just genuinely confused as to why their second speaker just continues to add on benefits to an argument that we have already flipped. We told you that they're less likely to get people watching their movies in the very first place through politicization. They say, it won't be extreme explicit politicization. That doesn't matter. At least some group of people will still be locked out. But further, we told you that the graphic negativity in and of itself means that a lot of people don't want to watch it, because cinema is a form of escape to them, not to be reminded how terrible and horrible the world actually really is. So for all of those reasons, the amount of viewership they gain is absolutely marginal. They had the burden on them to prove why majorities watch this and majorities respond in a beneficial way. So on both of their metrics, proposition deserves to lose.
I would like to thank that speaker for that fine speech. Now I would like to invite the third speaker on side proposition. Whenever you're ready, here.
Am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay.
Before I start, how would you take a POI?
Huh?
POI preference.
Oh, I want my POIs in chat. Okay, I'll begin my speech in three. Oh, sorry. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to explain two comparatives. Firstly, which movies will get more often from the minority, and secondly, which creates more social change. Firstly, then, which movies will get more often from the minority? I want to largely know a couple of things, but the first thing they say on their side opposition is that minorities already know the struggles and what they want from these movies is escape. I contest with this premise right from the start. Two things. Firstly, if they want escape, then they're probably not looking for relatability on the screen, right? Therefore, what they would likely be content with is things like, for example, white superheroes fighting on the screens. These things are more likely to provide you with the extraterrestrial kind of feeling. These things are likely to be unrelatable, and these things are likely to be more utopic. And therefore, you would likely get the same kind of entertainment that you want from cinema from these unrelatable movies that aren't necessarily people from your ethnicity. Therefore, if they want entertainment, then there's other forms of accessing it. Secondly, like even if like they want escape and want sources of hope, they can still get it from other source that is not just media, right? For example, they can be talking to friends and stuff. So I think that's not the only purpose of watching a movie. It's not very likely that entertainment is the only thing they want. I'm going to explain that further down the bench, but I'm just going to briefly move on and say and give you an actual mechanism as to why opt-in and backlash from the minority is a more probable context than opt-ins, because they never mechanized this, but this was one of the most important things that they needed to say. I have two things. Firstly, while watching the movie, as Elo says, you relate to the character because your skin color is the same, right? Then, if the character is going through extremely different scenarios, then you actually feel isolated and disconnected, and therefore you would not watch utopic movies in the future, right? Secondly, even if while watching the movie, you get this entertainment and escape, two things likely happen. A, the gap between your life and the character is just too big, and therefore you internalize hate and insecurities, and that you are not good enough, and that you are not living up to societal expectations or what you could actually be possibly doing. But B, the majority do not understand your struggles anymore because of the movies that are popular on media, right? Therefore, you're probably going to be angered at the movie, you're probably going to feel isolated from the majority, and etc. Now, therefore, these two scenarios prove to you that after watching the movie, even if the movie itself gives you entertainment, and even if the movie itself was enjoyable, the minority will be incontent with the effects of the movie, which means that there will be opt-out and backlash from watching these movies, and therefore they would not watch future movies. Therefore, we told you two mechanisms as to why opt-out and backlash is more probable than opt-ins, and therefore I think we already take this point on the minority. But why is entertainment actually more likely on our side of the house? Because as we framed, the producers would create a movie where the protagonist finds hope and happiness you feel within the struggles, right? They try to say in their LO that negative endings is always like the case, but they just assert this and they find no mechanism, right? We actually told you a logical explanation as to why the producers are likely to kind of make it hopeful and such, because nobody just wants to sit through a movie that's just pure suffering. This means that number one, while watching the movie, these minorities are likely to feel content and hope and entertainment because these protagonists that they relate with is finding hope and happiness. But secondly, after watching the movie, you're less likely to internalize things like hate. The character is more likely to become your role model, and therefore the movie as a whole is likely to give you more personal growth. The movie is likely to be your favorite movie. Therefore, the entertainment and opt-in from minority is much more possible on our side of the house. Therefore, if they want the metric to be that opt-in from the minority is the most important thing in this debate, we take this debate on that. But secondly, I want to explain social change, and I'm going to prove that this is more important than minority opt-ins. Why social change around winning impact instead of minority opt-ins? Because minority can derive happiness in role models and escape from other works of art, as I told you, like Marvel movies, right? But this is the unique way and the only way in which majority is able to actually visualize and empathize with the struggles of the minority. Like, think about it, just reading the news and watching the news, which is supposed to be objective about how 20 people were killed by police this year, is likely to provoke less anger and less empathy than watching the movie The Hate U Give and actually emotionally connecting to the protagonist who lost her best friend to police brutality. Now, therefore, I think this is the exclusive impact of what minority artworks bring, and therefore social change is the most important delta in this debate. I'll take a POI before I move on. 3, 2.
Your only mechanism for opting out or backlash against these movies is to say that minorities don't feel any representation of these actors. But clearly, if it is about how they would live without the oppression, why is it less likely that they don't feel any representation by these actors?
I actually don't get that POI. I think you obviously feel more representation on our side, even if it's a small delta, because you're far more like hyper realistically like depicted on TV. I just don't get that POI, sorry. Now, they say in this point about social change that shock factor will mean that people don't inherently watch it. But the majority is likely going to watch the movie on both sides because there are 100 of people who cooperate with the production of the movie, all paid by the studio, whose incentive is to increase viewership and entertainment. This is the incentive analysis behind why you're likely to create a movie that's entertaining and accessible to the majority on both sides of the house. Therefore, the majority would opt in, even if there are shock factors. I think there's a strategic way of cycling around that shock factor that means that people will opt into these kind of movies. What do we tell you in return? We told you that this shock factor is actually going to be the tipping point for the majority to actually empathize, not opt out of watching the movies. Now, they tried to say that the shock value doesn't exist, but shock value comes from the fact that the minority is even struggling to begin with, right? Because oftentimes people don't understand to what degree Asian Americans are struggling unless they're able to visualize these things on the screen and unless they're able to have a character that they can connect to about these kind of issues. Now, they say as a response to this about desensitization, but this isn't even a direct response, but desensitization is unlikely because just because you see blood and violence on media, you don't automatically feel desensitized to it happening in real life. Like, for example, I watch a lot of Avengers movie, but if the whole city of New York was under a vicious attack by superheroes, I wouldn't be desensitized to that. Therefore, I think desensitization is extremely unlikely. Their analysis was extremely lacking on that regards, with no examples, no mechanism whatsoever. With that said, I want to move on to our point about more public support for minority movements, because we told you that there will be more support for things like struggles, and there will be more people that are accepting of the fact that minorities are struggling. Like the counterfactual, as we painted to you from first, is where minorities or struggles are largely undermined as insignificant or not real, because that is not the norm that they see on media. What they say in return, side opposition, is that cinema is a way of escape. So politicization will isolate people from movements. On the likelihood of impact, I just contest with this, right? I don't think that people, like, they have zero mechanism as to why people are only looking for escape. Presumably, if they're looking for escape, they can go watch other movies like Marvels and stuff. But what they want from movies as a whole is they want to have something that they can take away, right? They want things like education as well. So therefore, that is the mechanism as to why things like Parasite was one of the most popular movies in 2019, right? Therefore, I think on the likelihood of the impact, I just contest with the fact that people will automatically isolate from the movements just because they want cinema and they want escape. Now, I just want to finally note the mechanism that came completely unengaged from all of their speech. I think Op Whip is just way too late with this, but we told you that more minority actors and more minority producers will be in position of influence and power, right? Because number one, there will just be more minority employment because they're trying to make a hyper-realistic minority movement filled with minority actors and minority insight, right? But secondly, that there will be more cooperation with the minority community as a whole because more minority community is willing to work with the movies and such because they feel more related to these issues. Therefore, these are independent mechanisms as to why you're likely to create more social change insofar as there's more minority in position of influence and power to be able to make the media narratives, to be able to actually change and become like the starting point for a whole minority movement to arise to begin with. For all of those reasons, we think that we are far better for social change. I already told you why social change is a round-winning impact, and thus we take today's debate.
I would like to thank the speaker for their fine speech. I would like to invite the third speaker on side opposition whenever you're ready here.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to keep my cam off because like my signal isn't strong because I don't have electricity. Sorry about that. I can be heard clear, yeah?
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you. I'll be taking POIs in the chat. Prop 3 says a significantly important line. He tells us, look, there are people that don't believe that minority struggles are real. Here's my question. Why would someone that doesn't believe that minority struggles are real watch a movie specifically depicting minority struggles? Why would a person that simply doesn't believe that there's structural racism against Black people watch a movie that depicts structural racism against Black people? However, what that same person would watch is a movie about a utopia where there are superheroes, where there's fiction, and where there's a lot of action coming along with the movie. Because he might not be able to relate with the levels of racism that are shown even in that movie on the outside world, but what he can relate with are the other proportions. So several pieces of context to note here. Because within Black Panther, you do see racism, albeit not nuanced. T'Challa goes through a ton of racism. He's oppressed from the beginning. That's why he becomes the person he is. Look at, say, Wonder Woman, who faces extreme amount of sexism the moment that she leaves her utopia. The very way that you portray these places as utopias is by showing an outside world that is not a utopia. So yes, I agree, we don't have the nuance and the realism that you do, but it is uncharitable for you to say that we portray these communities as perfect in the real world. That being said, what we uniquely do on our side of the house is that by putting in fictional utopias and making other people who don't really believe in things like structural racism and sexism, by pulling them into the cinemas, we are then able to hint, we are then able to subtly gesture at the racism and sexism that exists. These are far more likely to be impacted on our side, since you don't even get them in the theaters to begin with. We, however, do a slow but sure impact by showing them bit by bit, piece by piece, what structural racism and sexism look like. Two classes in this house, but before that, I'll take a point.
Showing struggles piece by piece is what rhetoric that has been used by people who don't want to make change for centuries and periods of time. We need to get immediate action and show people what tangibly people are going through to fill out the lack of lived experiences. That was
Ma'am, that's my point. My point was that you're not gonna get the people who don't believe it in the theaters anyway. People who do believe in structural racism and sexism. They are on your side no matter what you do. What you need on your side uniquely, and the people that we bring in uniquely to the theaters are people that don't believe you. They're just gonna shut up. They're just not going to get in the theaters on your side. But two key clashes. Firstly, then, on the clash of awareness. Now, this is fundamentally not necessarily very important, because this runs on the premise that Pop's argumentation runs on the premise that you don't really have awareness on our side. But movies aren't exactly the greatest or only form of awareness. Rather, you have social media, you have activists, you have the news. Take, for example, George Floyd being murdered. I'd argue that that's pretty great awareness right there as of the police brutality. This debate, this is not a unique impact that side proposition has. But furthermore, I disagree when they say that there's no awareness on our side, because like I said before, the way you portray a perfect utopia is by portraying a scenario outside said utopia, which means that sure, it might not be as brutal, it might not be as hyper-realistic, but you do portray racism, and they're completely fine with that, because that does create that sense of relatability, and it does imply that this does exist. But note that, so therefore, we don't really believe that this clash of awareness actually holds that much significance in this debate. One, it's not a unique impact, but two, any impact that you can get is marginal and far outweighed by the negatives that I'm about to portray in my second clash. Second clash, then, what this actually reflects upon the viewers. Two types of viewers here. Firstly, minorities, and this is where proposition decides to, this is the hill that proposition decides to die on, because they tell us three key things. Firstly, four key things. Firstly, they tell us that, oh look, there's no nuanced representation within these types of things. Therefore, you don't really have much role models, because you can't exactly relate to the kind of struggles that they go through. Look, I'd argue otherwise. I'd argue that general depictions are generally enough for you to be able to relate, because firstly, understand that there are characters that do go through, say, subtle sexism and racism or other sorts of misogyny within these types of films. But let's buy their best case, and let's say that the only characters within these films are like perfect individuals who are ultra rich. I'd argue that these people also face subtle hints of racism and sexism and misogyny outside their utopia. But fundamentally, what do we do here? What we do through utopic movies is that we portray an ideal representation of what these communities could have done without oppression. The woman utopia of the Amazons portrays a scenario of what women could be had they not been oppressed during Victoria era times. Wakanda portrays what Africa could have been had colonialists never colonized them. This then puts down narratives that currently exist. Narratives like Africa is doomed to be poor for life. Narratives like the reason why Black people are so poor right now is because of their own fault. That's why African third world countries are collapsing. Fundamentally, we provide the unique picture here. Every most people know that racism and sexism exists, but furthermore, there are other avenues of telling people that a simple history textbook is going to tell someone that slavery existed and slavery was bad. What we uniquely do is that we say, look, had these never happened, these people could have been better. We picturize what this better world could have looked like. We tell people that this is your potential, this is what you can be, this is what you should be, and inspire them to become that better version of themselves. Fundamentally, we have a unique impact here, and the uniqueness of our impact far outweighs the marginal impact that they can have through better relatability. Because even a slightest amount of relatability is able to garner that spark of hope that these people require to get through their lives. The second thing that they tell us is that there is that you're going to internalize hate by saying that you're not good enough as a character. Look, utopic worlds are obviously fiction. What then do people really think when they go through fiction? Two things. One, people tend to push away like unrealistic scenarios. Obviously, you're not going to have some super fruit that's going to make you gain superpowers. That's completely unrealistic. You're not going to really internalize hate because of it. But secondly, what people uniquely do within fictional movies is that they push away unrealistic scenarios and want to embrace the scenarios that pull their heartstrings, scenarios that actually make them relate. This is a selective bias that people have. When you see Superman, you don't exactly relate with his superpowers, sure, but you relate with the struggles that he goes through when trying to communicate with normal society and live a normal life. You embrace that and it makes you feel like he's relatable. There's a unique bias that people have. It's not, oh, he's relatable and oh, he's not relatable. There's a gray area here where people selectively decide to be relatable to character. By providing someone of your group, we make it relatable. Sure, unrealistic characteristics exist, but people tend to push those aside. The third thing that they say is that there's a venue for artists. Have you seen Black Panther? Do you know the number of black actors that were there in Black Panther? Intuitively, that argument makes no sense since we also have minority groups on our side. But what do we uniquely give you? One, we told you that we spark hope. But two, what we tell you is that their model within itself makes no sense, because when they come up and they tell us two things. One, they tell us that it's tipping. Two, they tell us that it's happy. Look, if it's a happy ending, and the struggle is supposed to be the tipping point, which is their final clarification, I'd argue that you're portraying the same message that you accuse us of. Sure, you're facing structural racism and sexism, but if you fight hard enough, maybe you can also get your happy ending. They accuse us of putting this up, but we make it clear that this is a fictional world. They, however, depict this as a real world scenario, which is far more drastic, because now you're telling people in the real world that you can find happiness, and if you don't find happiness, that's your fault. You're just not strong enough. Fundamentally, since you're specifically telling people that this is a real world thing, as opposed to us telling that it's a fictional thing, the impact here is far more drastic on their side of the house. The internalized hate here, I'll opt all the energy that they take here and say that the internalized hate is far greater on their side with side opposition.
I would like to thank the speaker for that fine speech. I would like to invite the opposition reply speaker whenever you're ready here.
Hi, am I visible and audible if I speak like this?
Yes, you are.
Okay. The reason this proposition loses this debate is that they have no consistent understanding of what their case wants to defend. Because in first, their biggest impact is they get more awareness. In second, no, that's not the most important thing. It's rather who benefits minorities. When we deal with that in my speech, in third, somehow they revert back to talking about how they get more awareness and how that's easily the most important thing. But crucially, beyond this even, they were still more contradictory, because they could never agree on what exactly this depiction of hyper-realistic oppression is likely to look like. Because first speaker tells us this is going to be extremely brutal and vivid, because that needs to be the tipping point towards shock to get majority buy-in. Second speaker says, oh no, we'll just have them being hopeful as well. Hope is not a unique benefit on your side of the house. The final weird clarification that third speaker pushes out is that, again, note, only told to us in their third speech, is that the tipping point isn't like brutal depiction of oppression. The tipping point is you struggling and succeeding against that oppression. Akindo, I think, already dealt with this more than enough when he told you that if this is the case and internalizing bad expectations is actually a bad thing, that is far more likely on their comparative because their movies are hyper realistic, whereas ours are obviously fictional utopias. So according to their own harms that they've spent 3 speeches building up, their clarification of what they stand for does not make sense. 2 independent paths to victory for the opposition. Firstly, on more awareness of minority issues. Now, here's where I'm confused, because their big stakeholder here is people who don't read the news or are bigots and just don't think that Black people go through structural oppression. But like we pointed out consistently right down our bench, why are these people likely to go and watch movies about the exact thing that they don't believe exists? But the second thing they say here is that they say that brutality is the tipping point. We then pointed out on their very analysis that if this brutality is really, really bad, this either leads to disengagement or worse, desensitization. You become desensitized, maybe not to a Black person being whipped because they didn't pick enough cotton, but rather what you do become desensitized to is the comparatively lesser suffering that Black people go through on the ground daily. That that's because weird response about how he would care if New York was bombed doesn't matter. What we did tell you is that that form of oppression that is often exaggerated crowds out the oppression that people feel on the ground. So that response in turn doesn't cut it for response. What were then the unique mechanisms we gave you as to why we get more awareness on our side that is still unresponded to 3 speeches down the line? First, we told you that our mechanism, our analysis about showing the counterfactual without oppression gives people an independent reason to care. The people who care about Black people because they think slavery is bad, they are probably going to care about Black people on either side. On our side, they can realize through Afrofuturistic fiction, for example, what those Black people could have achieved if they weren't oppressed. This thing gives them another independent reason to care about these communities. But then we told you that we don't lock out the people who aren't as oppressed, affluent Black people, white passing Black people. These are significantly numerous people, groups of people that they never wanted to engage on. This is crucial because this wipes out the biggest part to victory at the end of their third speech, and this wipes out all of the prerequisite analysis that they need about minority backlash. That is the only contribution they have in my second part to victory. They have no way to win the debate. My second part to victory is very short on how we benefit minorities more. I think they just completely strawmanned all of our arguments because we told you only uniquely on our side do we give them more hope. The third speaker and second speaker wants to say that they get hope too, but we pointed out the problems that this creates for their case. Given that, we think that the uniqueness of this hope is really important because awareness probably exists on both sides. Only on our side does hope exist. What this thing means is that minorities on our side understand why the struggle they go through is worth it. Minorities on our side want to fight so they can create better worlds for their communities generations down the line. Only on our side do we benefit the most vulnerable. Even if proposition wants to switch to another part to victory in reply, we win on both of those grounds. Oppose.
I would like to thank that speaker for that fine speech. I would like to invite the government reply speaker whenever you're ready here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Three, two, one. Opposition spends 24 minutes pretending our case was something that it wasn't, because their only assertive response is that if movies are so shocking and gruesome, no one can get hope for it because it's too horrifying. I would just counter assert that this is not true. But we actually told you why this was the case. 3 things to note here. 1, movie producers are not idiots. Obviously, they won't show a 2-hour movie about people carrying water from a lake. No movie is going to say Africa is doomed for life because they'll lose their target audience of Black people and no one will show up in theaters. That is a bad response. 2, you can show small glimpses of happiness and better lives that are realistic because you're a minority. You can show how people who are getting bullied at school found better jobs and were able to get therapy to overcome their traumas. I don't see why we can't claim this on our side. Thirdly, if they want to support superhero movies of Black people are only going to watch this apparently. 1, it is unclear why people would watch a Black superhero movie over just watching Spider-Man, which historically has more rep anyways. But secondly, we already weigh public opinion down to the way the movie affects the individual minority's perception of themselves. They directly need to engage with this weighing for this clash to be winnable. I want to talk about 2 things in the speech, 1 regarding representation and secondly on societal change. Firstly, on representation, our argument here was actually comparative, because our argument was that if someone living in the third world that doesn't have access to education are getting denied basic rights, watches a movie about a utopian movie that is not going to impact them in any way. A realistic movie about someone, even if they're in a first world country facing poverty, is comparatively a lot more relatable for them compared to Superwoman. White passing black people are not the most vulnerable stakeholder in the debate. That is an assertion from Reply, and that is just a lie. They say here that Beyonce is still black, so you relate to her. Two things. One, not every person relates just because you have a similar trait to them. We are all built of various different parts of our identity. Not every autistic person relates to Good Doctor because he's literally a genius. But secondly, relating to her, just trying to use this movie to find hope is absolutely a terrible idea, because someone starving and singing Beyonce's song is not going to actually solve anything for them. Taking risk and trying to become a singer in a third world country is just unlikely to be successful. We want people to be able to derive actual knowledge and learning from these movies and find tools in the toolbox to counter the issues that they're realistically going through, and that is a unique benefit we claimed on our side that brings tangible impacts to people on the ground. But even if you don't buy any of this argumentation, we have three independent arguments that got very little engagement that still stands. One, that there is a non-consequentialist obligation for movies to be representative because people have no other alternatives of voicing out their opinions. Two, regarding employment, that more Black people are likely to get hired because there's higher demand for interviews than actually hiring Black producers, because you need to hear their stories to create hyper-realistic movies. Thirdly, this drives extreme degrees of guilt, self-hatred, and social scrutiny to individuals as to why they can't be like the person in the movie as well. The response we get here is that people know that this is utopian, but I think there's two things to point out here. One, if this is the case, then they also do not get a lot of, then that also takes away a lot of their impacts, because people know that this is fake and this is utopian, so it is unclear as to why people derive hope from something that is fake. But secondly, if we take the premise of their case and think that people cannot tell this difference, all of our harms about how people will scrutinize you are likely to come into play. Listen here then to Opwhip's rhetoric, because Opwhip says this is what you can be, this is what you should be, and apparently this is what we should say to struggling Black people. But opposition just blatantly ignores the structural barriers that individuals go through to get these benefits. Not all of us are born into first world countries and become Beyonce. That is just unrealistic. At best, you buy all of our harms on decreasing societal support because you decrease urgency. At worst, we win because opposition doesn't have an impact anymore. Secondly, regarding change, the issue with opposition is that they have two independent paths to victory, but they never prove why one is more important. So the comparative that opposition pushes that you get more viewership. We give you two mechanisms as to why we get more viewership on our side that actually manifests into change, because that's the delta in the debate. One, that when you see graphic images, your empathy starts. Secondly, that this flips the core reason as to why people do not act right now. People don't not act because they don't know these issues exist. That's true. But the reason why people don't act is because they simply cannot imagine or think about what these daily struggles look like. If you're not a minority, you don't know how much microaggressions hurt you. Men don't understand why catcalling is such a bad issue, and we fill in those lack of lived experiences. This is obviously a lot more effective than during the experience of Spider-Man trying to talk to normal people, because that is the exact same storyline as Hannah Montana. But note, the only response we get is to the first mechanism, and they don't actually respond to the second mechanism. They say that people are going to get desensitized, but obviously they're just more likely to get desensitized on their side compared to ours, where we show gruesome, shocking images. Even if people get desensitized, we still have an independent path to victory, which is our second mechanism, which is really, really strong, that just does not get a response to. If people want to watch Marvel movies, they'll do that on both sides. The unique benefit on ours is that you get representation for minorities for all those reasons proposed.